All right, so in chapter 15, this is talking about the somatic nervous system. Okay, so somatic nervous system can either be sensory or motor. So the somatic nervous system is always talking about, in the sensory side of it, we're talking about general sensory, general sensations. And you guys remember what general senses are? Things like pain, temperature, vibration, touch, crude touch, fine touch, things like that. Proprioception, those are all the general senses. And so we have, on the sensory side, we have these general sensory receptors that detect those general senses. And then those receptors are going to activate a sensory neuron. That sensory neuron is going to go into the spinal cord and synapse onto another neuron and then travel through a sensory pathway up to your brain. And then your brain is going to process it, and then it's going to send out a command through the motor, the somatic motor pathway. So here we have some sensory processing. You have both conscious and subconscious commands that will be sent out. Those will travel down through the brainstem and the spinal cord, through motor pathways, and then we split, okay? So the split here is that some of the motor pathways will go through the somatic nervous system out to skeletal muscles, and that's chapter 15, and some of the motor pathways are going to exit out of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves and go out through the autonomic nervous system, which is chapter 16. And so the effectors in the autonomic nervous system then are different. They're going to be smooth muscles, glands, cardiac muscles, and adipocytes. Okay, brain, spinal cord. So you have your general senses. Okay. Most of those general senses are going to come in through spinal nerves and come into the spinal cord. Some of them will come in through cranial nerves, right? But most of them are going to come in through anything in the head and the neck that you're feeling, that's going to come in through a cranial nerve. Anything below the neck, that's pretty much coming in through spinal nerves, right? So there's receptors out here, and these receptors look like specialized cells. We're going to talk briefly about receptors. Well, we're going to talk a lot about receptors. And then they send that information through a sensory neuron into the spinal cord or into the brain directly through a cranial nerve. Either way, it has to get into the central nervous system. And once it's in the central nervous system, it's going to synapse onto another neuron, and then that neuron is going to travel up to the thalamus. It's going to synapse in the thalamus, and it's going to travel up to the cortex areas. So if you remember, in the cortex, where that ends up, it's going to end up in this post-central gyrus, right, which is also called the primary somatosensory cortex. So do you remember that from chapter 14 when we were talking about that? We said that all general senses are going to end up here in this post-central gyrus, which we call the primary somatosensory cortex. They have to get there first. And once they get there, then that's when you become aware of the sensation. Until then, you don't know. You don't know you don't know about it. It reaches your conscious awareness. So you might have subconscious awareness, but it's going to reach your conscious awareness once it gets up to that point. So this is the somatic sensory nervous system, right? Going from the sensory receptor and then up to this post-central gyrus. That is somatosensory. So here in chapter 15, we're going to talk about these receptors. We're going to talk a little, and then later on, we're going to talk about the pathway as it goes in and then up. And that pathway is called a labeled line. So when we come back on Thursday, we're going to talk about different labeled lines. Some of the pictures that you have, diagrams that you have for your lab exam are going to be labeled lines. Each labeled line carries a different modality, whether it's pain or temperature or what it is. Let's take a look at the somatic motor pathway, right? So the somatic motor pathway starts in this precentral gyrus. And another name for that precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex. All right, so this is also, I know you, if you remember, all the neurons in this area, they look like little pyramids, and this is all your voluntary muscle contractions. And so we end up calling this the pyramidal system. Pyramidal means voluntary, but it's the somatic motor nervous system. So it all starts up here in the precentral gyrus, and we are going to see how that neuron travels all the way down the spinal cord, synapses onto another neuron, and then that neuron goes out to skeletal muscle. So we're gonna look at a couple of pathways for this. We're going to look at the pyramidal system, which is the voluntary, and then we're going to talk just briefly about the extrapyramidal. We're not going to actually look at the pathway, but we're going to just briefly talk about the extrapyramidal, and this is the subconscious muscle contractions. It doesn't start in the precentral gyrus. It starts in the basal ganglia or the cerebellum, but it does not start in that precentral gyrus. First of all, a term that I want you to know is called transduction. Transduction is when a sensory receptor detects a stimulus, and then it converts it into an action potential. So here's again your brain and your spinal cord. Here's that special sensory receptor. It has to detect a change, and it has to cause an action potential in that sensory neuron. So it has to generate an action potential. That process is called transduction. So if transduction doesn't take place, then that sensory neuron's not going to have an action potential. You're never going to know about it, right? So the receptor has to be able to detect it. That's the main thing. It has to be able to detect the stimulus. So for example, dogs can detect dog whistles when you blow it, right? Because their sensory receptors are stimulated. They're activated by that. But humans, our sensory receptors for auditory, they can't detect that, so you don't ever have transduction going on, so you never hear the dog whistle. We want to look at the receptors, and each receptor here has what's called receptor specificity. So there's many receptors, different types of receptors in your body. There's the special senses, and then there's the general senses, and each one of them has a specific receptor. The receptor is just sensitive to that unique stimulus. So a receptor is if a receptor has a very, I guess we could say that if they have a very low specificity, they have little receptor specificity, that means that they are going to be able to detect many different things. So they're going to be able to detect, like some receptors, the nerve endings in your skin, they can detect a lot of different things, and they might not be able to tell the difference between like crude touch, fine touch, pressure, vibration, things like that. So they have very little receptor specificity. But then there's other receptors that you have, like your photoreceptors in your eye. Those photoreceptors are very, they have very specific receptor specificity. They provide very specific information. The photoreceptors in your eye, for example, they're very rarely exposed to anything other than light. They're hardly ever. They're way at the back of your eyeball, so they're only specific to light. But to be honest, we're going to look at this in just a couple of minutes. You could probably, if you rub hard enough on your eye, you could probably stimulate those photoreceptors, and then that information is going to go back to your brain as light, and you're going to see flashes of light, right? Have you ever done that? Rubbed your eye and see flashes of light, okay? Because that labeled line is only going to bring that information of light to the brain, whether it's through pressure or through light. Okay, the area that's monitored by a single receptor is called a receptor field, right? So these are neurons. You can see these are just sensory neurons. Here's the dendrites, right? All the dendrites are up here. You can see all of them. And they are all converging onto this one axon. And so we can see that that axon is myelinated. That's one sensory neuron. So in this case, these sensory receptors are the endings, the free nerve endings of those dendrites. So they have very little receptor specificity. They're going to pick up a lot of different types of sensations. But as it spreads out like this neuron is monitoring this area of skin. So anytime you touch in this area of the skin, you're going to get an action potential being generated on this axon. So if you were to take 2 points and touch this area of the skin in 2 points at the exact same time, you're only stimulating this one neuron. So you're only going to feel it as though it's one touch, okay? But if you were to touch 2 receptor fields at the same time, so if you were to touch this one and this one at the same exact time, now you're stimulating 2 axons, so now you're going to feel that as 2 touches. So those receptor fields are, they're different sizes all over your body. On your tongue and on your fingertips, those receptor fields are very, very small, like only a couple millimeters, right? So if you're touching with 2 points, and we're going to do this in our lab on Thursday, if you're touching with 2 points, on your fingertip, with your eyes closed, you'd probably be able to feel that as 2 touches. You'd be able to feel both points. But if you took that same amount on your back, where the receptor fields are more like 2.5 centimeters, then when you do that small, it's going to feel like it's only 1 touch on your back. And you'd have to be wider than the 2.5 centimeters in order to feel it as 2 touches. So the labeled line is, you have the receptor, you have the sensory neuron that goes into the spinal cord, it synapses onto another neuron that's going up to your thalamus, that synapses on another neuron that goes up to your primary sensory cortex. That whole thing is called the labeled line. And each labeled line will only carry one modality. So maybe it's carrying pain. Maybe this one carries pain. Or maybe it carries temperature. Or maybe it carries vibration or proprioception or something like that. But it can only carry one. The labeled line will only carry one. All right, now when it gets up here finally to the brain, this is when you become aware of it, like I already said. And that's in the primary sensory cortex. The strength and duration of how strong that sensation is just going to be based on the frequency of action potentials, as well as the pattern of the action potentials, right? So is it coming constant and fast? Then it's going to feel like a stronger sensation. Is it going slower and sporadically? Then it's going to feel like a much less intense sensation. We have 2 different types of adaptation that occurs. Adaptation means that you're losing the knowledge of it. So adaptation. You're losing the awareness of it, right? So adaptation can be either peripheral or it can be central. Peripheral adaptation is going to occur at the receptor. Okay? And it's basically reducing the amount of information that's going into the spinal cord or the brain. Reduces information going into the CNS. Okay? Whereas central adaptation, on the other hand, this is going to, it restricts the amount of detail in the brain, or in the central nervous system. It's subconscious, so you're not really aware of it. And it restricts the detail in your awareness. So we're going to talk about these two types of adaptation. So we'll start with peripheral adaptation then. Peripheral adaptation, there's two different types of peripheral adaptation. One of them, there's two different types of receptors that cause peripheral adaptation. One type of receptor is called a phasic receptor. And a phasic receptor adapts quickly, adapts very fast. So an example of this is a receptor that detects temperature. You know, you're outside, and then it's warm outside, and you come in, and the cool air conditioning just whoosh, hits you in the face, and you're like, wow, is it cold in here? And then all of a sudden, very suddenly you start to get rid of that awareness of it, because your body just very quickly adapts to that temperature change. So that is peripheral adaptation. That is phasic receptors in peripheral adaptation. The second type of receptor involved in peripheral adaptation are called tonic receptors. Tonic receptors adapt slowly. So an example of this is a pain receptor. It's you injure yourself, and it hurts, and it hurts, and it hurts, and it hurts for a long time, even after when that injury should have healed. You still continue to feel that in things like chronic pain, all right? So they're slow adapting, and pain is an example of that. So central adaptation occurs because you are, when you have a sensation that occurs, you first feel it, but you're consciously aware of it, but then soon after that, you quickly lose the awareness of it because it's just not important anymore, right? So in central adaptation, you lose awareness because it's not important. Can you hear the hum of the laptops? Right? You can hear that, but you weren't before. When you came in the room, you were hearing it, but then you wasn't important, so you stopped listening to it, right? So that is central adaptation. Now, your higher centers in your brain, they can influence this central adaptation. Like that reticular activating system, it can heighten your awareness. So if, like I told you to listen, now you can hear it because you're actually paying attention to it, right? Whereas before, you probably weren't even aware of it. You're just not even consciously aware of it. So you can kind of tune out that background noise. But your RAS, when you're listening closely, now you can hear it. when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, all right, I need you to tell me where you're feeling pain, all of a sudden you're going to concentrate and go, okay, all right, now I know exactly, and you'll know exactly where you're feeling pain, but before that you might not, you might not be able to pinpoint it unless you're concentrating on it. We have both somatic receptors and visceral receptors. Okay. So the somatic receptors, like I said, they're part of the somatic sensory nervous system. The visceral receptors we're going to see are they're part of the somatic sensory nervous system, but they're coming from organs instead. Whereas the somatic receptors are coming from the skin, skeletal muscles, joints, and they are going to, both of these receptors are going to detect information. They're going to detect these general senses like pain, but they're going to get sent to different areas in your brain, right? So it's going to feel different. The somatic, like I told you, this is going to end up in your primary somatosensory cortex. And you're going to be consciously aware of it. Whereas the visceral organs, this pain is going to end up going to somewhere in your brainstem. So it's going to be more subconscious awareness. 1% of all sensory information will actually reach your cerebral cortex. So 1% reaches the cerebral cortex. Because you don't even feel your skin, the clothes you're wearing touch your skin, right? You don't feel that. You'd go crazy if everything that was being transmitted to your brain went to your cerebral cortex. You would be just going crazy because your skin's constantly touching your skin, or your clothes are constantly touching your skin, air is constantly touching your skin, there's movement inside your body, so you'd just be going pretty crazy about it. There are a lot more of these somatic receptors than there are visceral receptors. So your somatic localization is going to be much greater with the somatic nervous system than with when you're feeling sensations in the organs. So you have stomach ache, you're going to feel the stomach ache like all over. It's hard to localize it, right? But you get a little bit of a contusion, you know exactly where that is. You can localize it very well. So the visceral receptor fields are very far apart. So let's start talking about some of the different general sensory receptors. We can classify general sensory receptors either by location or by function. So if we're looking at location, we're going to classify them as either exteroceptors, proprioceptors, and interoceptors. This is just saying where are these receptors located. So the exteroreceptors, they are providing information about the environment, so they're found in your skin. Skin, mucous membranes. So the mucous membranes are inside your mouth, inside the passageways in your digestive tract, your respiratory tract, urinary tract. So those are the exteroceptors. Proprioceptors are found, and we know this from reflexes, they're found in muscles, skeletal muscles, that is, and joints. So we're going to see proprioceptors again. We classify them by location, but then we also classify them by function too. So we're going to see that name in both classification areas. And then interoceptors, they monitor the viscera, visceral organs. Okay, so that's three ways that three classifications based on location. The nature of the stimulus. Okay, so this is, now these receptors might be both interoceptors and exteroceptors, but they both detect pain, right? So we're going to look at what is the modality that these receptors are sensitive to. So the first type is a nociceptor. A nociceptor detects pain. So where do we find these? We're going to find them, like I said, they're exteroceptors, so we can find them in the skin and in joint capsules. And then they're also interoceptors, so we can find them in like the periosteum. That's the dense irregular connective tissue that surrounds bone. Or we can find them in blood vessel walls. Cut through a blood vessel wall and you're going to feel pain. They have, nociceptors have large receptive fields. There are some other things other than literal, cuts and contusions that would stimulate these nociceptors. So things like extreme temperatures. When you're so cold, your fingertips are so cold, they're going to feel pain, even though it's cold. It's because that severe cold is stimulating those nociceptors. So some other things that can stimulate these nociceptors are extreme temperatures, mechanical damage. So you actually cut through the skin, that's mechanical damage, or bruise it, that's mechanical damage, or even dissolved chemicals. So we see some dissolved chemicals in the body that stimulate pain, cause pain, like prostaglandins. When we get to the immune system, we'll talk a little bit more about prostaglandins. We did mention a neurotransmitter that was called substance P. We called it a neuromodulator at the time, if you remember that. So the sensory neurons that bring this pain into the central nervous system release this neurotransmitter called substance P, right? So we have our sensory neuron, and it releases substance P. Now another name for substance P is called glutamate. Glutamate, okay? And then that's going to stimulate the labeled line. It's going to stimulate that sensory pathway up to the brain. And we know what will inhibit those, right? What did we say would inhibit that? Yeah, opioids. And opioids, another name for that, they're a neuromodulator. And there's other neuromodulators like endorphins and enkephalins that will actually also inhibit substance P. So athletes, right? When they run marathons, they release endorphins like enkephalins and endorphins, and that will reduce the amount of substance P being released from the sensory neuron, and so they don't feel the pain because they're on what they call like a runner's high. These neuromodulators here are similar to morphine. So morphine it inhibits substance P from stimulating that neuron in the pathway, sensory pathway. Second type of receptor we have by function is called a thermoreceptor. Thermoreceptor detects temperature. So we find these in the dermis, so we find them in the skin. We find them in skeletal muscles. We find them in the liver. and also in the hypothalamus. We have more cold than we have warm thermoreceptors, so you're much more sensitive to cold. And what we said with thermoreceptors, did we say they're phasic or fast adapting, or did we say they're tonic or slow adapting? Yep, so they are, thermoreceptors are phasic, fast adapting. Mechanoreceptors. And they detect things like stretching or compression or twisting. Stretching, compression, twisting. That's what they're picking up. And there's 3 different classes of mechanoreceptors. The first class is called tactile. So this is just, it's picking up touch and pressure and vibration. Touch, pressure, vibration. Touch your skin, right? That is a tactile receptor. The second type of mechanoreceptor is called a baroreceptor. And baro, like a barometer. This one is going to detect pressure changes in blood vessels. So we have especially, there's 2 areas called the aortic body and the carotid bodies that contain really important baroreceptors. And there's other organs. There's other organs too, so I'm going to put other organs too. But the baroreceptors, so in your heart, there's your heart, and then you've got the aorta, and the aorta comes around, it arches around. There are some baroreceptors there in the wall of the aorta that are detecting the amount of pressure, because they need to make sure that the amount of pressure is adequate. Is it too much? Is it not enough? And it'll send a message up to the brain. There's also, if we look at the aorta, we've got the carotids, right? So we have the common carotid arteries. I'm only going to draw one here. It's the one on the right side, which has the trunk, and then it splits. The common carotid is going to split into an internal and external common carotid, and right there where it splits, that is called the carotid body. That also has baroreceptors. So the reason why these receptors are so important, the carotid baroreceptors, they're monitoring what is the amount of blood pressure going up to your brain. You don't want a whole lot of blood pressure going up there because you don't want those blood vessels blowing out. So if the pressure is too great, it's going to send a message to your body. You're going to have to try to reduce the amount of fluid in your body to bring that pressure down. If there's not enough fluid going up there, it's going to have to correct that too, so it'll get your heart beating faster so you can pump more blood up to your brain. The aorta baroreceptors and the aortic bodies, they're important because the aorta is delivering blood to the rest of your body. So you have to have the proper amount of blood pressure there too. So those 2 areas are pretty important for baroreceptors. But we also find baroreceptors in other areas, like in your, in any hollow organ really, like your urinary bladder, right? Your urinary bladder, it starts to fill up. Yeah, it's going to tell your brain, those baroreceptors detect that. They're going to tell your brain it's time to go to the bathroom. Or the rectum sends it up, tells your brain, time to go defecate. So you have baroreceptors in many other places, right? And then we have the last one, the last type of mechanoreceptor, and that is called a proprioceptor. So a proprioceptor is going to detect your position. So we find proprioceptors in your joints, and we find them in skeletal muscles. And it's just trying to keep you from falling over. So it's going to be constantly sending information up to your brain. Your proprioceptors are constantly firing, unless you're completely out on the bed, sleeping. it's going to be sending information up to your brain all the time. We have the chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are going to detect small changes in chemicals. And the chemicals in particular that we're interested in are oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. Those are the chemicals that we need to know. And there's two different types of chemoreceptors. One type of chemoreceptor is found in the central nervous system, so it's called a central chemoreceptor. So these are found in the ventricles, and they are detecting changes in the cerebrospinal fluid. So they're looking at cerebrospinal fluid, carbon dioxide, and pH. It's the level of carbon dioxide that's actually going to get you to breathe out. Because if your carbon dioxide levels get too high, it's acidic. Your body has to get rid of it, and it's going to want you to breathe out to get rid of that. That carbon dioxide goes up higher. We're going to see that when we talk about acid-base in chapter 27. And then we also have peripheral chemoreceptors. And peripheral chemoreceptors, they're found in those carotid and aortic bodies. Just where those baroreceptors and those blood vessels were found, right? And they're detecting these chemicals in the blood, not in the cerebrospinal fluid, so in the blood, and they are detecting oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. So why oxygen? Because your tissues need oxygen, so it's trying to detect that. That's it for this video. In the next video, we'll look at specific labeled lines for the somatic sensory and somatic motor nervous systems.